Hello, everyone. To discuss the U.S.-Venezuela crisis today, we welcome Dr. Jeremy Adelman, a renowned scholar of Latin American global history. Dr. Adelman is currently the director of the Global History Lab at the University of Cambridge in the UK, having previously taught at Princeton University. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
It's a pleasure and an honor.
So let's begin with our first question. To begin, what's your perspective on the U.S. strike in Venezuela and the capture of Nicolás Maduro?
Well, it comes on the heels of many years of difficulty that Washington has had in trying to let's say, arrange with different pressure points a transition in Venezuela or a restoration of democracy since Hugo Chavez took power in 1999. And one might say it takes place also against the background of many years of American extractive policies vis-a-vis Latin American natural resources, including oil. So there are multiple agendas behind this one. The last one I think that is not getting much attention, but is worth thinking about is the connection with China. That in a way one might say that the contest over Maduro is a proxy for a struggle between the United States and China over control over strategic resources. So, because Venezuela, the vast majority of Venezuelan oil exports went to China, and that puts some pressure on China as well. So I think there are multiple kinds of, one can see it through different sorts of prisms. It's like looking at a kaleidoscope. Well, about a little under 70% of Venezuelan oil is exported to China. Now, it is worth saying that Venezuelan oil exports, we should spend more time talking about the history of Venezuelan oil industry, but Venezuelan oil, while the majority of it flows to China, it accounts for a very small percentage of Chinese oil imports. So it's not that strategic for China, but it is one of the pressure points that the White House can exercise on China, which is a net oil importer, and vulnerable in that sense, and very aware of its vulnerability. So it's like many other areas. Everything in our interdependent world in this new geopolitics has been weaponized. And we're seeing the ways in which small countries with strategic resources are being pressured to align one way or the other. Though it is true that, and here we have to get a little into more detail on the Venezuelan oil industry, to refine Venezuelan crude, which is very viscous. It's a very heavy, sticky material. It requires, for some kinds of purposes, adding higher quality, more fluid petroleum into the mix. The other is, of course, the use of Iranian tankers and refining systems for elaborating the Venezuelan crude. So, in that sense, Iran is part of the picture, but it's not that strategic, to be honest, in this particular regard. On Venezuela, it's much more a story as one of the pressure points on China.
Aside from the praise for President Trump's decisive action against Nicolás Maduro, what do you see as the real motivation, if you will, behind the Trump administration's decision to remove him?
It's hard to say. It's a jumble, and if you watch that press conference, if that's what you want to call it, there were many elements thrown out there. There's one in favor of quote-unquote regime change and the restoration of democracy. That wasn't very highly touted by Trump, and Trump has not made the restoration of democracy or the promotion of human rights a particularly important part of his foreign policy, unless it's convenient for him, which it tends not to be. So it wasn't a very strong motivation. Whereas early on, the sanctions that were originally introduced against the regime in Venezuela were sanctions introduced, not for national security reasons, but for the promotion or the restoration of democracy. That's not a big deal for Trump, although it's a useful rhetoric. He really centered the role of oil. But it's hard to make too much out of that, too, because even though Venezuela is extremely dependent on oil, it is a petrostate, and we could talk about the nature of the Venezuelan petrostate. It's not very important to global oil supplies, certainly not to the United States. And so that itself is not even a very compelling reason. Drugs, which is the other claim, that there's been a narcotic trip, particularly around fentanyl. Venezuela is not an exporter of fentanyl. Most of the traffic goes through Mexico, in fact, or the Pacific routes, and not the Caribbean routes. So that also is not a particularly compelling case.
He's a brutal dictator, let's say it.
There is no question that he's a brutal dictator, and the people of Venezuela have been suffering for a very long time. Is this the way it should be handled? That's a question worth debating. I personally don't think so. I don't think going and kidnapping somebody. It's interesting that the Trump administration did offer an exit option for Maduro a couple of months ago, that he be allowed to go to a third country. Maduro, for reasons we still don't quite understand, I think perhaps he underestimated Trump and Trump's appetite for taking on these very adventurous exercises, in which case it was just a terrible miscalculation. He really should have just made off with his money and settled in Turkey or wherever he was going to go. That would have been one option. The thing to bear in mind is, even if you wanted to remove Maduro, which many people have been wanting to do for a long time, this particular model of adventurism makes the day after very complicated. A negotiated solution of Maduro taking a trip to Turkey and staying there in a palace and forgotten about would have been much easier to resolve the day after. Now you have some very deep fractures inside and outside Venezuela, not to mention the side effects on China, Russia, and other countries who are going to look at this kind of precedent as an opportunity for them to take it out on weaker neighbors. So I think that there are going to be many costs to this policy that are going to take some time to unfold, and it's going to be really the story about what happens in Venezuela is going to be very concerning.
Let's assume for a moment, and it's really grossly put it, that Maduro is a tumor, and how to remove a tumor, without being incisive, dramatic. It will be a very traumatic experience for Venezuelans. So what you're saying basically is that maybe President Trump made it more dramatic or not.
Obviously, if you want to liken it to a tumor, you can do careful surgery, or you can just chop off the limb, and this was rather more like chopping off the limb, and the penalty to the patient is really dramatic.
People are happy about it. You can see in the streets. I
actually think they're very internally divided. I think. I was listening to some footage this morning on the BBC, and you're getting all sorts. Some people really relieved that the Maduro regime is over. But Chavismo, the system is still there. And in fact, relying on the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, to stay in power almost ensures it's as if you removed Saddam Hussein but left the Ba'athist party in power in Iraq. That was one lesson. Don't remove the authoritarian regime. So there are some people who are rejoicing, some people who are just relieved, and others who were very supportive of the regime. Now, what are you going to do with a very deeply fractured society?
Moving on, President Trump stated then again that the U.S. involvement in Venezuela won't cost the U.S. anything, since American oil companies will invest in the country, and he added that it is going to make a lot of money. How credible you think is this claim, and what could it mean exactly for both countries?
You know, there was a lot of magical thinking on all sides, and I think this was a moment of great magical thinking. You know, the Venezuelan oil industry has been being decapitalized since the middle of the 1980s. Long before Chavez took power in 1999, it was being decapitalized. Hugo Chavez treated it as an ATM machine and brought it down even further. The current Venezuelan oil output is at about one-third the level it was when Hugo Chavez took over. There has been very little investment. The other is so that's on the supply side. You have to also note this point that I made earlier about it being very thick stuff. It requires heavy investment in the refining. I don't know many companies that would move into this theater right now and put a lot of capital into an industry that is not very profitable. The last thing to say is, you know, the United States has created exemptions for the sanctions regime that was imposed about 10 years ago, particularly for an American company called Chevron, which allowed them to join into a joint partnership with PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan oil company. Trump then revoked that exemption. This was done by Biden after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then several months later, Trump reinstated it. So that is to allow Chevron to operate in Venezuela. So American companies have been there ever since, and in a sense, being able to find their workarounds. It is not clear that they are going to want to put a whole lot of investment into, frankly, a dying and expensive, unprofitable industry. So, again, magical thinking.
Being realistic, will U.S. forces provide security only for critical infrastructure, you think, or will their role extend to broader public protection?
I have a hard time imagining a second wave with large numbers of boots on the ground protecting these strategic assets. This is one reason why part of the White House, and I think it'll really be Marco Rubio who's under the microscope on this one, will be try to make arrangements with the Venezuelan military. The fact is the Venezuelan military and internal divisions within the military currently take care of PDVSA. It's run as an arm of the Venezuelan military. They're not going to want to go up against the Venezuelan. They're going to want to cut a deal with them. That's, I think, what we're looking at. And to negotiate some kind of transition in that regard, where the military continues to hang on to the companies to take care of security, and leave the wider public security to somebody else. And there, the concern again, I really worry about Venezuelan civic life. That I don't think anybody's going to want to put boots on the ground. If the military, the American companies, and the White House get the extraction that they want. And the Venezuelan military takes care of the security of the oil fields. And the two main sources, the Maracaibo Basin and the Orinoco. And let the streets be run by the gangs.
How might these challenges unfold in a country affected by gangs, paramilitaries, guerrillas, and transnational cartels? You know, just to make it worse, I would say. How this is going to play out?
Oh, this is the concern of Venezuelan citizens right now. Now, it is worth saying that was the case already. It was a gangster regime. It relied on forms of coercion to keep it installed. So that hasn't necessarily changed, but the political vacuum that it's created has meant and created almost the incentives for there to be more competition between these gangs in the streets. And we've seen this kind of situation before. I would also be very concerned about Colombia. I mean, these kinds of instabilities have ripple effects in the neighborhood, and you can already feel the Colombian government very, very concerned about the wider regional security. Again, it's in the same way that the United States destabilized Iraq and created a problem for the wider Middle East. There is a risk that something similar happened here in the North and South America.
And then what should be done about the hundreds of political prisoners who remain detained, and why is their fate so significant at this moment, particularly at this moment?
Journalists, politicians, academics, civil human rights leaders. Yeah, I mean, it's an authoritarian regime. I clearly locked up the opposition, and if those who did not manage to leave, and we'll see whether Donald Trump makes that something that he wants to negotiate over and make as something that he wants to see large scale releases as part of a transition in the regime. Again, it's not a strong calling card of the Trump administration to make human rights and restoration of democracy a cornerstone of their foreign policy.
Please feel free to give your frank and very honest statement about the situation. Thank you.
I mean, I worry about Venezuelan civilians above all. And I worry about international law. I mean, the international law and institutions were installed for a reason, so that that bullies would be restrained, and be required to obey some basic fundamental principles, for instance, of the UN Charter that the United States helped to write. I do worry about countries, weaker countries, neighbor, smaller countries that are adjacent to big bullies. Now a precedent has been set, about kicking them around, and so I'm very concerned about that. I think there needs to be a wider discussion about the state of international security.
Are you saying that President Donald Trump broke the law, international law?
I think there's a pretty widespread consensus across the legal establishment that that's been the case. Now, he's not the first. So it's not as if we have to single out Donald Trump for violations of international laws. There is a question in the United States about whether he broke some national laws. Did he need to go to Congress? Now he's calling this, an act of the Department of Justice rather than a declaration of war. But the violation of state sovereignty is by definition, and the use of coercion in this way is an act of war. So I think there's going to have to be an American domestic conversation about the role of Congress.
What do you make the pressure that he made before by bombing those Venezuelan boats, I would say, and the American public, I have to say, it's apathic. It didn't do anything. It didn't say anything. It basically gave him a blank card, to do it.
That's absolutely right. And I think Americans need to be much more aware of the consequences of doing that kind of thing. So, but again, it's tempting to heap all the blame on the White House, but it's not as if there haven't been many years of this kind of activity before. This is just very stark and brazen, and I think it's going to require both let's say, an American conversation about his commitment to the rule of law, as well as an international one. And the organizations that look out for these things are in extremely weak, and now in even weaker positions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's hope that the situation gets better, and the Venezuelan people can find their way out of this mess.
I hope so too. That should be our primary concern now.
Thank you so much.